Welcome to Two Bees in a Podcast, brought to you by the Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory at the University of Florida's Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences. It is our goal to advance the understanding of honeybees and beekeeping, grow the beekeeping community, and improve the health of honeybees everywhere. In this podcast, you'll hear research updates, beekeeping management practices discussed, and advice on beekeeping from our resident experts, beekeepers, scientists, and other program guests. Join us for today's program, and thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast. Welcome to another episode of Two Bees in a Podcast. I am your host, Jamie Ellis, accompanied by co-host Amy Vu. Amy, what's up?
What's going on?
Not too much. We're doing a podcast. That's what's going on. Where have you been the last 5 minutes as we prep for this thing?
I don't know.
Anyway, Amy and I hope to lead what we believe is going to be a good episode for you today. We have a couple segments, the first of those being with Dr. Humberto Boncristiani, our very own applied research specialist here at the University of Florida. We are going to be interviewing him to discuss colony deadouts, what they are, what to do about them. Our second segment is going to be equally intriguing. We have this issue as beekeepers where our bees, our honeybees, that bee that we love to keep, goes and collects nectar and pollen from a lot of different types of plants. Sometimes those plants are invasive species. So we have brought to our episode today Dr. Jim Cuda, who's a professor of entomology at the University of Florida, who's an invasive species specialist, and we're going to be talking to him about pollination of invasive species, honeybee perpetuation of invasive species, and all of the issues at that interplay between those two issues. All right, and we will conclude today's episode with a segment of questions and answers, and I'm sure all of you believe really is just Stump the Chump, right?
The best part of the podcast, really.
Who's the chump?
Not me.
Not it. I think you got me. So
How many followers and listeners? How many followers and listeners do you think we have by this point?
I don't know.
10 million?
Easily. You kind of under there's like what 7 billion people.
I'm
on the
really
planet.
bad at math.
At least half of them are listening to us right now. All right, so guys, don't worry. We are going to clean up our act a bit and go into these topics that are of great relevance to you. So thank you for joining us today. We are happy to tell you now that we are accompanied by Dr. Humberto Boncristiani. Hey, Humberto.
Woo-hoo. Hey, Humberto.
Glad to be back.
All right. Humberto is here to discuss deadouts.
Dun, dun.
It's a scary term, right? So, a dead out. A dead out.
Yes.
It's a weird phrase, right?
What is the dead out?
What is a dead out, Humberto?
Dead outs are colonies that die in a beekeeping operation, and normally people don't know exactly why, and they need to handle with that.
Yeah, it is totally a term that you hear beekeepers talk about all the time, especially sidelined to commercial beekeepers. You'll say, you'll hear them, well, we had so many dead outs and we're not sure what to do with them, what to do with the equipment, et cetera. And so you mentioned, Humberto, one of the keys to a dead out is something killed them, but you're not quite sure what.
Well, yeah. Lots of times the colony die and the beekeeper doesn't know exactly why. And there's always that big question in the air. What's going on? Is whatever is going on in that hive is going to spread to the other ones? What am I supposed to do with this hive? Should I burn? Should I hide? Should I freeze? Should I treat with something? So that's the things we're doing.
So when people are talking about die-outs, Humberto, are they what's happening? They're going.
Amy, it's a dead out, right?
Okay. I understand that. But do they go up to their colony, open it up, and just find a bunch of dead bees on the bottom? Or, are they finding any bees? Does that mean they left? What is it actually, what does it mean? How are they defining a dead out?
Well, dead out is a colony that you open the hive and everybody's dead, or a beekeeper can see just a few amount of bees that we for sure is going to be dead in a couple of days.
Is it possible that you can go into a colony and find no bees? Does that also qualify as a dead out?
Yes.
So basically, the absence of all bees or the presence of exclusively dead bees is a dead out.
Mm-hmm. It's a pretty general broad term.
Yeah, it's just dead. Well, that seems
Well,
intuitive.
now I
This
totally-
segment is now over. I hope that was
that
good
was
clarity
simple.
for
All
you,
right.
Amy.
Good.
All right, so Humberto, what's confusing to me is one of the things that you said earlier, though, is you said essentially the bees are dead or gone, right? Which we assume that means they're dead too. So, but a beekeeper doesn't know what happened. Often, you didn't say that it's always the case, but it's often the case that a beekeeper didn't know what happened. So how in the world would someone not know what happens?
Well, beekeepers cannot be observing the hives every single day. So, and when the hives are in the field, they're exposed to many different variables, the many different pathogens, different environmental factors that can affect the health of the colony. And when beekeepers go back to the yard and see one of those dead, there is always a question, what happened here? And it's very hard to make sure of things.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely hitting the nail on the head, right? You're not in your colonies every day, and sometimes it's every week, sometimes it's every other week, depending on season, right? You go back 2 or 3 weeks later, you find these conditions that are what we would call a dead out, but you scratch your head, not sure what caused it, right?
It is hard. Could be somebody spraying things around, could be some pathogen in that region, could be a bear, could be...
That is so key, Humberto. The first thing that you said was could be someone spraying, which of course alludes to pesticides. In my experience, when someone has a dead colony and they can't explain it, that's almost always what they default to, is believing that it was some sort of pesticide kill.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And I tell people that, we really need to set the bar high for what we're willing to accept as a pesticide kill. There's a big checklist of things I like to go through first and say, well, did this happen? Did this happen? Did this happen? Because to me, a lot of those other things are actually more likely causes. So in addition to pesticides and some of the weather issues that you might have noted, what are some other things that can lead to a dead out? What can cause a dead out?
Pathogens, for example, mites, or all of these factors combined can create a situation that the colony is going down.
Yeah, I think one of the head scratchers for beekeepers, though, right, is when you find dead bees, it's a little easier to maybe do some thinking about what killed them. It's when you find no dead bees that people start getting really mysterious with their description, right? Mm-hmm. That's what came up with colony collapse disorder. But it's really just dead outs that we've had for a long time and that we can't really explain.
Yep, correct.
So is it really possible for mites and pathogens to take bees down that fast?
Yes.
Did you guys see my social media post on Facebook? There's a video that I added, and I had shared it from someone, but it goes into slow motion of this varroa mite. 2 of them are on this bee, and it just takes one little...
They're just passing through.
Yeah, just passing through and just jumped onto
the
the second bee, and it was such a quick thing that was happening.
Yeah, that's the thing is I struggle, though, with this concept, right? A lot of beekeepers, I was just in there a week ago, and I came back, and now everything's weak or dead or dying. And I just struggle with this idea that colonies can collapse that fast. But I think they do.
They do, and people avoid to see the facts that a mite is a problem. If you do not keep an eye on that, you're going to have problems.
Yeah, so there are lots of different factors, right, into a dead out. You've been doing a lot of research on how to handle dead outs, and that's something that the commercial beekeepers really wanted to see you focus on. So do you want to talk a little bit about, what you've done as far as research?
I think that's key if you think about it, right? Mm-hmm. Commercial beekeepers lose their bees, but don't want to lose the hive, and they're coming to you. And if you don't know what's killed the bees, you're scared, right? Should I reuse this equipment? Is it going to be safe to future colonies? How can we clean this? And that's what they came to you asking, right, Humberto?
Yes, beekeepers came to me ask for solutions for that because if people at home doesn't know, wax is one of the most expensive things for the bees to build up. And beekeepers want to reuse the equipment and the wax from those frames. So we need to find ways to reuse safely. So beekeepers reach out and ask me to find different solutions. So here in the lab, we are testing different compounds now to see if we can clean that in a safe way. Testing different kind of compounds, testing on the bees to see if it's safe to the bees, to see if the queen is still laying in those environments. So we're doing different kind of tests to make sure we're going to provide information for the beekeepers.
And of course, you're trying different methods that would be applicable to
Yes,
beekeepers.
everything
you
that
know,
I do is applicable, and we're going to have a solution for beekeepers soon.
But even beyond your research, Humberto, this is an issue that people have tried to address for years, and since 2006, since colony collapse disorder, right, or
Dun, dun,
CCD,
dun.
or what now everyone calls colony losses. Since that happened, people have really invested heavily in research. I see regularly a paper here and there on irradiation of equipment, right? I've seen people try to use ozone to sterilize wax. I've also heard of heat sterilization. You're looking at it more from a chemical perspective.
Well, I like to talk, mention that as a beekeeper perspective, because need to be something, I work with commercial beekeepers, so it need to be something fast and easy and not costly. So that's what I'm focusing right now, to find different compounds, make it very cheap.
Man, Humberto, that is so key, right? Because irradiation works, but you usually can only irradiate a small amount at a time, and it's costly.
It's costly. Can cost $20,000 a year in a commercial beekeeper operation.
And the efficacy of ozone's not that great, and you have to have a really good generator and a really thorough saturation. So really, the stuff you're looking at is hopefully practical and applicable to beekeepers in the field and low cost. I think that's key. Usually, what I tell beekeepers who ask, can I reuse equipment? I say, usually, that most of the time you can. I work under the assumption that whatever killed the bees is likely not able to survive without them. Of course, there are some exceptions. American foul brood is one of those, right? You really just need to burn colonies. But fortunately, you can look at the combs and see if it was American foul brood, right? We'll talk about that in future podcasts. However, maybe pesticide residues could be a reason that people didn't want to reuse equipment, but pesticides have half-lives, right? So I always tell people, maybe perhaps most of the time you can, but how stable are viruses and some of these other pathogens on comb in the absence of bees?
Viruses are very stable. They were built to survive in their environment until the next bee passed around, or they have some level of toughness. Let's put it this way.
Do you have a time?
That's hard.
Let's say you're a commercial beekeeper. You go into an apiary that has 30 colonies and they're all dead, and you just assume it's not pesticide related, and you've checked your boxes and there's no clear evidence of American foul brood. When would you be comfortable reusing that equipment in the absence of some sort of treatment that you applied to sterilize it?
Oh, that varies. Depends of the organism. Some organisms, like you just mentioned, you said in absence of American foul brood. This is the extreme case, the spore-forming bacteria that can stay for a long period of time. But other organisms can stay pretty long time. A virus is complicated because it's correlated and dependent of the transmission by varroa. The virus in the comb itself, there is no much data still showing that bees can get virus directly from recycling wax, for example. But we don't know what happened with those viruses in wax, so it's always good to keep an eye open on this thing.
Can I ask a dumb question? This is truly because I don't know the answer. The sun is a powerful sterilizing agent for many pathogens. Is it possible to just open the box and expose all the combs to solar radiation?
Yeah, they do like solarization on soil.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I would say that would help a lot, but I would not close my eyes to the possibility for some of these organisms to be evolved to be protected against that.
What about freezing?
So freeze, we know that work for a couple organisms, like eggs of small hive beetles can be killed with freezing, but viruses, that's the way we put them in a refrigerator to keep them alive, to keep them in. So freezing doesn't work with viruses.
Well, Humberto, you have been a great guest as we talk about deadouts. This is an issue that must be addressed. It's a widespread issue around the world with beekeepers, and I appreciate you looking at it, and I look forward to seeing how other scientists are addressing it too.
Happy to be here.
Thanks, Humberto.
Thank you.
For more information about this podcast, check out our website at www.ufhoneybee.com.
Welcome back to Two Bees and a Pod. I'm your host, Jamie Ellis, accompanied by co-host none other than the Cameron Jack. Hey, Cameron.
Oh, well.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime. Well, you know you're a co-host, so you can come anytime you want to, right, Cameron?
I'm glad to be here.
All right, fantastic. Well, Cameron, we have a really good segment here. We are accompanied by Professor and Fulbright Scholar Dr. Jim Cuda. He's a professor here at the University of Florida, Entomology and Nematology Department. Welcome, Jim. It's great to have you.
Good morning, guys. It's so nice to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, Jim. So the reason we brought you into our podcast today is because we need to discuss a topic that is a little bit difficult, right? When we mention this around beekeepers, we almost always get dirty looks. And the topic is this. Beekeepers, we are all aware that our bees forage from a lot of plants out in the environment. Sometimes those plants are invasive plants. And there are occasions across the U.S. and the world, for that matter, where invasive plants are important nectar resources for honeybees or important pollen resources for honeybees. So from our perspective, bees benefit significantly from these things. But on the other hand, we're the minority. A lot of governments, local officials, individuals, various environmental organizations, etc., obviously want to control a lot of these invasive species. So we find ourselves here kind of at this interface where there might be management strategies put in place for a plant that is otherwise very important to the beekeeping industry. And so Jim, you're here because we have an example of that here in the state of Florida. Then we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about more examples across the country. And I'm just going to let Cameron lead off on the questions as we kind of dive into this very issue, this interplay between honeybees and invasive plant species. Cameron?
Sure. Well, I think probably most of the people listening maybe have at least are a little bit familiar with invasive species, but can you give us kind of just a simple, basic definition of how you would define an invasive species?
Well, in my view, invasive species is kind of any organism that does not occur here naturally. It's been brought in either by humans directly, or it's something that emigrated here, but it does come to our system. And then once it gets here, it generally comes here without the natural enemies that normally keep it in balance in its native range. So what it does then, it takes the resources that are available, it maximizes its growth, and then basically starts to displace the native species.
So that's an important thing. So not everything that moves outside of its introduced range would be considered an invasive species, right?
No, there are some that come here basically that probably would not be an issue, but some that do come here, like Brazilian pepper tree, for example, they have the reproductive strategy such that they produce a lot of these berries that are dispersed by birds. Mm-hmm. And once those birds get a hold of those berries, that's when it starts to spread. And it's that, I think it's that interaction between, let's say, our native bird populations or native mammal populations. Once they start feeding on those berries, then things start to explode.
So listeners, what Jim's referring to is we have an invasive species here in Florida called Brazilian pepper, and it's a plant that occurs in the southern half of the state. We're going to talk about it in great detail with Jim moving forward, but this idea is that a lot of things can come into the U.S. or escape their native range and not be invasive. They're just there, but not necessarily a threat. But in the case of invasive species, they're displacing native species and causing sometimes environmental and even economic damage, right?
That is correct. Like Brazilian pepper tree, I would say currently there's about 700,000 acres currently established here in Florida. And what's happening now, you have like state and federal agencies for years now have been trying to manage it and keep it at least in check. Now, like you said, currently, the population is probably restricted to Central and South Florida. But over time, we've seen along the coast, we have it as up in Franklin County in the Panhandle. We have it as far north as Brunswick in Georgia. So along the coast, so where the temperatures are kind of moderate. But what's going to happen, I think, if you are subscribed to the idea of climate change, as things warm up, it's very possible this whole thing could move further north. We've done some research along those lines, looking at some modeling, niche modeling that showed, yes, in fact, based on the types of the genotypes that we have here, that's another issue I can get into as well. But the genotypes we have here now are sort of like pre-adapted to move north.
So Jim, Cameron asked, what is an invasive species? But really, another thing that people struggle with is why should the general population care? I'm going to ask as a citizen and not as a scientist. I know the answer to this question, but why do I care if Brazilian pepper is all over the place in South Florida? It's not hurting me. The price of my food hasn't gone up. My gas prices haven't gone up. Why should I care?
Well, I would say something like Brazilian pepper tree and perhaps other invasive plants and maybe even animals as well. 40% of our endangered species are affected by invasive species. They pose a serious threat. So now you have native populations that are at risk already, and you have some other organisms coming in like Brazilian pepper or some other invasive species, and now they start to move in, particularly some of the threatened plants, and we lose that biodiversity, period.
Yeah, I think, of course, that's important because when people talk about loss of biodiversity, you don't know really what you have in a population, right? There's all potential. Just looking at it selfishly from human perspective, there's potential human uses for plant and animal species that we don't know that we can use them yet. So to lose those things would be a travesty. But we also, just environmentally, it can be detrimental to lose species. Entire ecosystems could fall depending on the species that falls, right?
That's correct. And I remember not too long ago, I happened to go to the museum here, and they had a display of, a mount of the last passenger pigeon here. And I'd read about it for years, and basically it's like to see something like that, to see it was the last one that died in the Cincinnati Zoo. And to see it and think that at one point in time they blackened the skies, it's heartbreaking, really.
So do we, in your opinion, should we spend the money and the time to, control the invasive species? Is it beyond our reach to even control some of these?
Well, I've heard people say, well, we're part of a global community now, and things are just going to move, and say, why should we care? Well, again, I think because we don't really know a priori what the ultimate effect of something like an invasive plant when it comes to how bad it could be, or an invasive insect, and so on, what would happen if, to our native flora and fauna once these things get here. I think we'd be hard pressed not to do something.
Jim, I'm a taxpayer, right? And most taxpayers who aren't thinking about these things probably would not struggle with the idea. Yeah, it's fine with me if a few of my tax dollars go into controlling invasive species. That's fine, and most people are oblivious. But there are times, and of course this is a honeybee podcast, there are times where the control of an invasive species, while monumentally a good idea, can hurt a particular segment of the industry or the population. In our case, it's beekeepers, right? Let's dive into this Brazilian pepper idea. Brazilian pepper, for beekeepers in Florida, is a very important honey plant, right? Beekeepers move their bees from all around the country to get this plant. And the reason it's, quote, so good for honeybees and beekeepers is because it blooms at a time of the year, kind of August, September-ish, when there's nothing else really available for honeybees. So as a result, beekeepers move their bees down to South Florida in droves because there's this abundant honey crop that may not be so palatable. It's not a great tasting honey, but it's marketable, right? Or they can build up their bees and prepare their bees for winter. So while, in theory, most people on planet Earth are probably okay with resources going into controlling an invasive species, we've got this one segment in Florida that says, wait a minute, this is an important crop for us. And for you listeners who aren't from Florida, don't worry, Cameron and I are going to expand this discussion to include other examples. But we want to use Brazilian pepper, Jim, since we have you. We want to use Brazilian pepper as a case study to explore this specifically. So tell us a little bit about Brazilian pepper. You've already mentioned it. When does it bloom? Where did it come from? What has it been doing specifically in the Florida ecosystems?
Okay, Brazilian pepper tree is native to South America, Brazil, Paraguay, Argentina, and in Brazil primarily, which is the source of our Florida Brazilian pepper tree. It occurs along the coast, all the way from northern Brazil down to southern Brazil. And what's made it kind of interesting is that we discovered, because we couldn't rear some of our insects that we were studying, that we had two separate introductions of Brazilian pepper tree here in Florida. And we were able to track this genetically. Thank the molecular tools we have now, we were able to discover that one source came from southeastern Brazil. And of course, if you think about that, southeastern Brazil is furthest from the
equator, I
guess.
Yeah.
Thank you. The equator. It's further from the equator, so that distance means it's in a cooler environment.
Sure.
And then we also had some from northeastern Brazil, and that obviously is more adapted to
the tropical
area.
Yeah.
So now we have two genotypes that are separated in their native range by over 800 kilometers. They were brought here into Florida. One was around Punta Gorda on the west coast, which was the one from southeastern Brazil. And the other one that was from northeastern Brazil was introduced into Miami. And these were all occurred. I think the one in Miami was around 1890s and so on.
Far back.
Yeah, and then the one in Punta Gorda was about 1926. So it's a little bit more recent. But again, once they got her, the plant is insect pollinated. So now they basically started to hybridize. And now what we have are these novel genotypes. And again, because we have these novel genotypes, this gives rise to what we believe is hybrid vigor. And we have some data from the field to show that, the hybrid is actually produces much more viable seed. And even those that survive are actually much more vigorous.
That's incredible. So the plant that was produced from the cross is potentially more invasive than either one.
Right.
You know, it's funny, we see the same thing with African honeybees, right? We've got this hybrid vigor between the European stocks and the African stocks that created this hybrid bee, the Africanized bee, that's very good at taking over entire ecosystems.
Right. So anyway, once we had it here, it's basically got spread throughout the region, and over time, like I said, the bird population, in particular robins, were instrumental into dispersing it. Now you have to think about when this all was happening. Why is Florida so prone to this sort of thing? Well, we have a mild climate. Okay, we have disturbed landscapes. We had a lot of construction going on during, the 50s and so on. And that's when Brazilian pepper tree really started to become a serious problem in the 1950s. And if you look now, when you drive along the interstates, toll roads, you can see Brazilian pepper tree along the highways.
Yeah,
that's where underneath the power lines where the birds sit, right? Robins and stuff. So again, it's been a really incredible problem that, again, fortunately, up here in Gainesville, we don't have to deal with it that much, but I just think it's just a matter of time.
But surely the state has assigned some sort of economic value to the losses, right? They're not just saying, we have a lot of it, we need to control it. They are basing this on a decision, right?
Well, absolutely, because, again, it displaces, obviously, native species. But one thing that's interesting about Brazilian pepper tree, I don't know if it's a big issue now, but it also contributed to other invasive species problems, things like the Diaprepes root weevil, which was a major pest of ornamentals, and citrus. Of course, citrus has its own problems
now. Yeah, of course, yeah.
But when you have a large population of Brazilian pepper tree, now you increase the population of the Diaprepes root weevil, which is another invasive pest. So you have this environmental or ecological
synergism
flow-on effect.
Wow, that's interesting. I've not heard that.
So now you have those. So then, Brazilian pepper gives the Diaprepes root weevil. If you increase those populations, you got a greater threat on ornamentals and citrus because of the Diaprepes root weevil.
So we need to control it. Could you tell us a little bit about your research looking at control and the history of control and what people are doing now? I mean, the reason we're interviewing you is because something's been released to control it, and beekeepers are up in arms. So let's talk about that.
Well, I've been working with Brazilian pepper tree biological control since about 1998 when I first started in my current position here at the University of Florida. And at the time we were studying about three different insects, defoliating, I guess it was called a sawfly, the thrips, which is now currently released, and we were trying to study, I think, a moth, which actually was released in Hawaii. So again, let me just back up and say that Brazilian pepper is not only a problem here in Florida, but it's a problem in Texas, California, and also Hawaii. Now, Hawaii actually started a biocontrol program in the 1950s. And they released this one moth that I was very much interested in because it had been established in Hawaii since the 1950s, but didn't do quite well there. And the reason being is that we discovered that Hawaii was like this magnet for biological control of agricultural pests. Over the years, they took a big interest in using insect biocontrol, parasitoids and predators to control some of their agricultural pests. What we found out also doing the literature search was that some of these spilled over onto the insect that was released there to control Brazilian pepper tree, so it dampened its effect. Again, we studied this insect and we tried to get it released here because we felt like it's already been established in a new environment and didn't cause any serious environmental impacts because it was only attacking Brazilian pepper tree. And in fact, there's a native species of a plant that's very closely related, or at least in the same family as Brazilian pepper tree, in Hawaii that was not attacked at all. So we felt like there was some evidence of some sort of inherent specificity there. And back then, In the 50s in Hawaii, they were only concerned about agricultural pests. They weren't concerned about native plants or threatened and endangered plant species that could be at risk like we are today.
So Jim, you're using the word or biological control a lot, right? So let's back up here and set the stage for the reader or the listener. So you've got this threat, you got Brazilian pepper. There's multiple ways you can control it. One is biological control. We'll get there. One way is mechanical. You just physically go chop the suckers down and push them away. A second way is you can herbicidally control, right? You just spray a lot of compounds out in the environment. We're going to talk about biological control. Are there any other types of control for invasive plant species? So mechanical, herbicidal, and biological?
To my knowledge, I don't think so. Those are the big three, and what we try to do is try to integrate them in such a way that you could basically combine them so they kind of complement each other.
Kind of an integrated pest management. So you said biological control. Could you define biological control for the listeners?
Okay, biological control, and again, there are a lot of different types, but I'm going to talk about what's called classical or importation biological control. This is where you basically discover an organism in the native range where Brazilian pepper came from, identify potential organisms that, let's say, are feeding on the plant, or in case of a disease attacking the plant or infecting the plant. You look at those and you say, okay, we want to introduce those into this country. So basically, classical biological control is reuniting the plant pest here with its natural enemies that occur in a native range. It's as simple as that, trying to find the ones that are specific to that target weed, in this case, Brazilian pepper tree, testing it to make sure it's only going to attack Brazilian pepper tree, and then getting approval for release and so on.
The way I usually teach biological control is everything that is alive has something that makes it sick or tries to eat it.
There you go.
And if you can find that something that makes it sick or try to eat it and rear it up and release it, you can hopefully get an effort, attempt at controlling that something.
And I would say, biological control probably is not a very fast process most of the time, right? So
I'm glad you brought that up, Cameron, because what I think, as I recall, when you first came to Florida, you invited me to one of your beekeeper things.
I did. That's right. It was a big issue back then. They heard rumors that University of Florida was going to release things, and so we had you come speak.
And I was glad that you did that, because what I try to tell people is that if you look at the other control technologies, mechanical, okay, that's immediate. You go in there, one day, 24 hours later, all the Brazilian pepper is gone.
Yep.
So now if you had bees interested in those plants, forget it.
Yep.
They're done. Chemical control is a little slower, and it's more of a temporary control. But even with that, depending on the herbicides, and you're going to get some of death fairly quickly, probably within the same growing season.
But if you think about it too, Jim, chemical control is not so palatable to the citizens
Obviously,
of the U.S. They're like, people are like, oh gosh, you're broadcasting herbicides everywhere.
Yeah. And then of course some of these herbicides, and not so much the herbicide himself, but maybe some of the carriers, some of the surfactants, maybe affect bees. And
potentially.
But what I also try to tell people is when you have something like a biological control agent, it takes years. Years for them to build up populations, really start to be high enough to really start to seriously affect the performance of the plant. And there is absolutely no case that I'm aware of where a biocontrol agent actually totally eliminated a plant. It can't do that, because what happens, because the populations of the biocontrol agent are so closely tied to the population of the plant, eventually, let me say, the population would get so low that it would basically escape essentially the effects of the biocontrol agent, so the biocontrol agent dies, all right? You have that lag effect. Then eventually the plant starts to come back. So there's always going to be a reservoir of, let's say, Brazilian pepper tree plants around.
I think that's a really important point, because when you guys, we're going to talk specifically about the release in a second, but when you guys, you and your colleagues released stuff for the control of Brazilian pepper, we were always getting phone calls and emails because they thought essentially these things were going to obliviate Brazilian pepper instantly. But if I understand you guys correctly, you're only expecting a relatively specific biomass reduction, but over the next 15, 20 years, right? It's not like BP is going to disappear tomorrow. We're talking, there's going to be a transition time. Could you explain what did you release, and what is that transition time?
Well, we released one of two insects, the thrips, which surprisingly, and this is kind of an interesting story as well, was released first in July of this past year down in South Florida, Broward County, and then later in October in St. Lucie County. Now, as I said, I started working with this thrips in 1998 when I first got here. But as we discovered over time, is that because of the genetics of the plant we didn't understand it at the time. We also found out as we started to really get into the genetics of the plant that there's also very cryptic species of the thrips that are associated with these plants.
Sure,
and the
why not?
one I was working with at the time, it was specific to Brazilian pepper tree, but it didn't perform very well on the Brazilian pepper trees we had here. It wasn't until, as I said, we discovered the genetics of the plant that we can go back and really match the A thrips that was very specific to, let's say, the type A or type B that we have now here. And now, not only is it specific, but it can really reproduce well on these current Brazilian pepper trees. So, and again, once what's happened, you release them, it takes them for time to build up, and then eventually the plants will be impacted. And you can see this now with things like melaleuca.
Sure.
Air potato, that was a very quick one. Air potato, everybody had air potato problems. In fact, they still do in some areas. But once the beetles were released in a matter of about 5 years, we don't have air potato anymore.
Yeah, but that's kind of an extreme example, right? That's a bigger success. So, for you listeners out there, again, this is a Florida story, Brazilian pepper, but this is not a Florida issue, right, Cameron? You know, it's again this issue. There are other invasive that honeybees visit that beekeepers use for honey production purposes. There are other species out there that are subject to biological control, and beekeepers in those respective areas are essentially having the same issues that we're having here in Florida with Brazilian pepper.
Really, I mean, everywhere that I've lived, I've seen this issue. You know, I grew up in the South, really southern Nevada, where tamarisk is everywhere. So tamarisk is also called salt cedar, grows in a lot of kind of river areas around Rio Grande. So it's a big issue through Texas, all the way through California.
New Mexico.
New Mexico, yeah, sure. And so, this plant is a great, nectar producer. And it actually makes a really good honey. I like dark desert honeys. It's good. But, everybody else, is trying to get rid of it because it's a terrible invasive and it can cause a lot of problems. And so I've seen there's a chrysomelid that's been released in the
Diarrhabda beetles complex,
sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that's one instance that I'm familiar with. I also I did my master's at Oregon State University, so I lived in the Pacific Northwest where Himalayan blackberry is just everywhere. It's just big, thick, bushy. I liked it personally because because I'm a beekeeper and it makes a ton of nectar, and also because I made blackberries that you could just go off the street and pick up some blackberries. But it just crowds everything out, and it just makes a big mess, and it was really hard to clean Himalayan blackberry up. It was big, thorny, and would just grow up.
Were there efforts to control Himalayan blackberry?
Yeah, there are. I'm not aware of any biocontrols that are used for that, but a lot of mechanical controls of them kind of cutting it down, burning, a lot of herbicidal controls, and as Jim said, kind of that integrated approach of trying to use kind of all three.
Yeah, so Jim and Cameron, I mean, these problems aren't even unique to where you guys are. I'm actually from Central Georgia, and the principal honey plant for me when I was growing up was actually Chinese privet. And if you go anywhere in Central Georgia, that is the plant that's growing on the roadside. It's considered invasive. When I was in Europe, every time I go to the UK, I see talks on Himalayan balsam, which is a plant that grows in riverbeds and stream beds that's incredibly invasive there, that there are efforts to control that. But of course, is an incredibly important honey plant. And back to Florida, in the Panhandle in Florida, there's Chinese tallow, which some people call popcorn tree. It's an incredibly invasive plant. Now, I think someone from LSU, Jim, is releasing a flea beetle to control Chinese tallow.
Yeah, actually, the USDA here in Florida actually basically was involved in screening.
Interesting.
Let's see, Bacacia is the genus for the beetle, but I think LSU is involved in some of that research as well. But I know there's been a lot of resistance to it.
Sure.
But let me go back to something. We're thinking about this, and maybe you guys can educate me. Now, Brazilian pepper tree is a dioecious plant. What that simply means is that there are two separate sexes. There are male plants and female plants. Now, they both produce flowers. My question to you is, does anybody know if bees use the male plant flowers differently than the female flowers?
Well, dadgum you, Jim. I was not prepared for such a good question. The short answer is I don't know. I'd have to ask my colleagues.
Okay, because
maybe you can find a thrip that only eats females.
Well, no, it's going to eat. But here's the thing, though. We're trying to develop what's called and I've seen this where some of the chemical control people do
The
this.
plant version of the sterile insect technique.
Well, not
The sterile
quite. But what we're seeing, though, like you say, in somewhere, it's like Brazilian pepper tree obviously occurs along the coast near mangrove forests and some of these other areas that are really sensitive that you cannot use herbicides. Or if you do, you have to do it very carefully. So one of the things they've been talking about, and I think they've been doing this for a lot of years, is something called matricide, where they go out and selectively only kill the female plants. Because obviously, if you think about it, if you kill the female plants, those are the ones that are actually producing the seeds that are possible or responsible for the spread and dispersal.
So the female plants are the troublemakers,
The
right?
troublemakers,
All
right.
Just the female plants.
I'm not going to go there.
No,
I'm not going.
Jim, I didn't go there. I said the female plants.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
So anyway, but we were thinking about this in terms of trying to develop an IPM. Now, if we have the insect, the thrips, and even the psyll that we're going to release later, is they're not going to distinguish between the male and female plant.
Yeah, sure.
However, if you could direct your control efforts to the female plant, and of course, if you kill some of the biocontrol agents that are on the female plants, so what? They still have the male plants as a refuge to sort of maintain themselves on. So this is something where we're trying to figure out, but it's going to take a little extra effort because you'd have to go out in the fall, and you can separate male and female plants fairly easily. They're fairly distinct, and maybe just go out, maybe mark the trees or something, or just go out there and just selectively control either how they want to control those plants or not. And I think everybody will be happy. And you just
That
still have
sounds like a great project.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
You maybe need a PhD student for that, Jim.
Well, I don't know. But still, it's something we've been thinking about.
It's funny, this concept of biological control or control of invasive species for that matter never really entered my mind until I was a graduate student. I did my PhD work in South Africa, Jim,
Right,
so you
I
might
remember.
appreciate this story. When I was there, the South African government and scientists had figured that invasive plant species were sucking up 20% of the nation's water. And so what they did is South Africa is a water-limited country. And so what they did is they developed this program called Working for Water. The idea is that they would mechanically control invasive plants. And in South Africa, one of the invasive plants was eucalyptus, the tree from Australia that the Australians call gums, we call eucalyptus. And that's, of course, an important honey plant. So they were pushing them over with bulldozers, those and other invasive plants. But the seed bed was so intense that seeds would prop up and propagate. The plants would come up for the next 20 years. So they'd push down these plants, and then they'd herbicide every year for the next 20 years. So my point is, there's biological control, there's mechanical control, there's chemical control. And beekeepers, what I'm trying to tell you, and this is not a popular message, but governments, scientists, regulatory agencies, they are going to control invasive species. At least they're going to try to control invasive species.
Yeah, and I
right,
think,
Jim?
and if you think from a federal perspective, in December 2016, I think President Obama issued an executive order, a new executive order, safeguarding a nation's biota and agricultural products. And which this did is amended the 1999 executive order issued by President Clinton that basically coordinated or mandated that federal agencies coordinate their efforts to control and manage invasive pests. So again, this is from
Full stop, period.
Full stop, yeah.
All right, so with that background, I think that's incredibly important. So the point is, beekeepers, federal agencies are going to try to address invasive species. Sometimes those invasive species are going to be plants that are important to honeybees. Not just honeybees, native bees use them as well. So I'll put that out there. However, there's got to be a beekeeper response, right? All right. So what is that response? Well, number one, we need to tell you we are optimistic that these things are going to take a little bit of time, right? So there'll be a period of adjustment. Number one. Number two, it's going to change strategies for feeding bees, especially in the case of Brazilian pepper, because Brazilian pepper is a plant that blooms at a time of year that otherwise feeding would be necessary. There are a lot of invasive plants that bloom in spring, and maybe losing those might allow other things. We'll talk about that. But feeding bees, or strategies for feeding bees, or nutritional management is going to be very important when a honey plant is taken out. Secondly, one of the sales pitches is that removing an invasive plant like Brazilian pepper or Chinese tallow or Himalayan balsam or Himalayan blackberry or tamarisk, etc., is that it opens up the ecological niche to allow native plants that are hopefully nectiferous, produce nectar or produce lots of pollen. It opens up the environment for those to come back. So the idea is that maybe native plants that bees can use would rebound. The third thing that's important to remember, Jim, you mentioned this to me before we even came on the air, is restoration. Having a plan in place before the control of that plant to restore the land with pollinator-friendly plants. So don't just kill Brazilian pepper, have a plan to replace Brazilian peppers. So talk a little bit about restoration strategies.
Well, I think this was actually something that was brought up in one of the international symposiums on biocontrol years ago, where it's trying to be proactive and say, okay, we don't know what's going to come back once you control an invasive plant. Now, here's a good example. We've had a very effective biocontrol program for Melaleuca or punk tree here in Florida.
Which, by the way, is important for honeybees.
Honeybees, too. Right. And they've had 3 biocontrol agents. In fact, I guess the first biocontrol agent was released, I think, in about 1988, 89. That was the weevil. But bottom line is, if you look around, you see Brazilian Melaleuca now, it's not doing well. There are 3 agents taking it out. But you know what's coming back, if you look very closely to what's moving into the areas where you're starting to have the decline? Brazilian pepper tree. So, again, sometimes you just can't let nature just take its course, because you open up a niche, something else is going to come in just as bad. But you can be proactive, find, like you said, identify certain plants that are fall nectar producers, and have a plan to put those in there, start growing them.
Yeah. Admittedly, Brazilian pepper is unique because of the time of year it blooms. It's a little bit of a struggle to figure out how to restore land in a way that makes up for the Brazilian pepper loss. So really, it's just feeding strategies, I'm afraid, at this point. But however, some of these other that are spring bloomers, there can be plans for restoration, especially with natives, like in the Panhandle where Chinese tallow grows. Perhaps things like gallberry or palmetto, things like that, tupelo, for example. All of these are things that are native plants that are important to honeybees, and the same is probably true around the U.S. Well, wow, you have been an incredibly insightful guest, Jim.
Well, let me have another
Please do.
question here.
Take another question.
Okay, as I said, Brazilian pepper tree didn't become a problem until about the 1950s. What were the bees using here in Florida before the 1950s? Or weren't beekeepers here in Florida? I suspect they were.
So they were, but they didn't have populations of bees as big as they do now. In fact, what's interesting is there's been a significant growth in the number of colonies moved to Florida over the past, say, 10 or 15 years, and probably a lot of that's in response to Brazilian pepper. Let me explain the system for you. One of the most important pollinator-dependent plants, honeybee-dependent pollinator plants in the United States is almond. So every year, about 60% of the managed honeybee colonies in the U.S. move to California to pollinate almonds. Well, almonds bloom in late January and February. So Florida, specifically South Florida, provides the ideal place to move your bees to overwinter. You get a massive Brazilian pepper flow. You've got a warm climate. You can get your colony strong before you head out to California. You can't keep bees in the north and do this because the colonies won't be ready otherwise in winter because it's just too cold. But in Florida, there's just been an increasing number of commercial beekeepers who move to South Florida to take advantage of Brazilian pepper, take advantage of the climate, and be ready to head west to pollinate almonds. And that's kind of the issue. And so, you know, they feel when the loss of Brazilian pepper, the rug's going to be pulled out from under them. You know, this whole infrastructure that supports that will be gone, and it's a big deal. So that's why you've been such a wonderful guest today. Listeners, this has been Dr. Jim Cuda. He is a professor and Fulbright scholar here at the University of Florida Entomology and Nematology Department. His specialty is biological control and insects. Jim, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'll send you guys an invoice, by the way.
Right, absolutely. Hey, we loved having you. Can we have you again?
Certainly, anytime.
Great, insightful. I hope you guys enjoyed that or listening to this segment, and look forward to talking to you more on Two Bees in a Pod.
Welcome back to Two Bees in a Pod, the question and answer time. We're going to stump Jamie. We'll try to.
I'm sure you can. I'm not sure you will, but I'm sure you can.
All right. So we have a couple of questions today from the audience, and someone's wondering, you know, we're trying to save the bees, right? But what about the wasps and the yellow jackets?
What about the wasps and the yellow jackets? So the only reason I'm familiar with wasps is because we get a lot of calls about, nests that people have on their property they think are honeybees that are wasps. And I also know a bit about wasps because I had a former graduate student, Jason Graham, who looked at solitary nesting bees and wasps, and we had a lot of wasps show up in the solitary nest sites we made. So the funny thing is despite the fact that we are the largest entomology department in the country, faculty-wise, we have no wasp specialists. So I would argue that wasps are understudied, and we likely don't know the answer to that question. I have seen reports that suggest that there are wasp populations that are suffering, but I just don't think there are enough wasp scientists. We need more. So hopefully if you listeners are out there want to come into grad school, there's some potential for you there.
I was just about to say it's probably because wasps sting over
It's
and over
funny,
and over again.
One of the things I think that's important to this question is should we even save wasps? And I would say wasps are incredibly important.
I agree.
Yeah, right?
Agreed.
They are predators, very fierce predators of a lot of insect prey. So they help control a lot of the things that we don't like. Caterpillars in our gardens, certain flies, for an example. Some eat spiders, which themselves are good, but for the purposes of this discussion, wasps might eat them. Grasshoppers, other things. So wasps are really good, and if their populations are suffering, and I'm sure there are some species whose populations are suffering, then we should do something to address it.
Absolutely. So with that, we always see wasp nests. We always see bee swarms. People are always catching swarms. And so my next question is, about bait hives for swarms. So when you're setting up a bait hive for swarms, do you usually install frames with foundation? Do you leave it empty? What do you actually suggest as far as that goes?
Well, first I'll briefly explain to the listeners who don't know what a bait hive is. A bait hive is basically a dummy hive that you hang up in an area hoping to attract a swarm of honeybees looking for a cavity or place in which to nest, right? And so bait hives are best hung usually between 20 and 30 feet in the air. And the questioner, of course, is asking, is it appropriate to put combs in the bait hives? And I've heard arguments both ways. And so the problem with putting wax into a bait hive is there are no bees there to protect it. So it is going to be very susceptible to wax moths and likely to be destroyed anyway. The only type of comb that you would benefit maybe by putting in there is white comb, newer comb, but I just don't know that the benefit's worth it. Bees are used to moving into cavities that have no combs. But it would be one of those things that listeners can experiment with. If you're someone who uses bait hives and you put out 10, put combs in half of them and not the other half, and see if you get a higher capture rate with combs in or with combs not in.
Yeah, are there any studies as far as the percentage of bees moving in?
So I'm not aware of any, but the beauty, Amy, is that we are going to have Dr. Tom Seeley from Cornell University on a future podcast, and he is the world expert in home finding for bees, and he will be able to answer that question. So make sure you put that one in your pocket and bring it back out when he gets here.
Awesome. All right, now speaking about homes and bees, I want to talk a little bit about queen cells. So the last question we have for you today, people are seeing queen cells in a thriving colony, and they're wondering, should they destroy it or should they leave them?
I destroy queen cells in thriving colonies unless I need queens in queenless colonies. So for example, if this particular colony is in fact thriving, that suggests that it's doing well compared to its neighbors. And so if you've got a neighbor who has an underperforming queen or no queen at all, you can use cells from the thriving colony to requeen those other colonies. If everyone is otherwise fine, then I remove queen cells. I don't want that swarming tendency or stimulus to be in the nest. So I cut them out unapologetically.
That's where you take all your anger out.
That's right. Well, queens are good some of the time, but not all of the time.
That's fair. All right. Well, thank you very much. Those are all the questions for today.
Hey, great questions. Thanks, listeners. And anytime you have a question for us, make sure you post it on one of our social media accounts. We are more than happy to try to answer online. That's at UF Honeybee Lab. Thank you for joining us for Two Bees in a Pot. I'm Jamie Ellis.
And I'm Amy Vu.
Thanks again, and look forward to you listening next time.
We'd like to give an extra special thank you to the following. To our editors, Shelby Howell and Bailey Carroll, and to our audio engineer, James Weaver. Without their hard work, Two Bees in a Podcast would not be possible. So thank you.
For more information and additional resources for today's episode, don't forget to visit the UF IFAS Honeybee Research and Extension Laboratory's website, ufhoneybee.com. Do you have questions you want answered on air? If so, email them to honeybee@ifas.ufl.edu or message us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook at UF Honeybee Lab. While there, don't forget to follow us. Thank you for listening to Two Bees in a Podcast.